On Thursday, the United States Supreme Court issued a decision that is really widely being held in a great deal of surprise. An Alabama congressional map was struck down earlier this week by the U.S. Supreme Court as being unconstitutional in a 5-4 ruling that was actually surprisingly joined in the majority, in the 5-4 majority, by Chief Justice John Roberts and Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, joining other more liberal progressive justices in a 5-4 decision striking down an Alabama congressional map. I'm Tim Darnell, and we are continuing to bring you all of the latest in political coverage here from our Midtown studios here in Atlanta News First. And we're joined this afternoon by Alicia Hughes. She is the interim director for the Center for Civil Rights and Social Justice at Emory Law School. This was really kind of a surprising decision. Is that something you would agree with?
In a manner of speaking, yes, but somewhat no. I think that we have oversimplified what's going on in America in terms of classifying folks as either Democrat or Republican, classifying folks as either liberal or conservative. And I made this point on Scripps News on Tuesday of this week. Conservatism isn't something that is ubiquitous. And I said, Justice Kagan, when looking at the ruling coming up from the appellate court or the Court of Appeal, she said this should be a slam dunk. This is an easy case. And what that means is I don't really understand why they took it up, aside from the fact that they want to get their hands on Section 2 because someone had something to say. So from the vantage point that this is an easy case, and you look at the fact that on the Circuit Court of Appeal level, we had 2 Trump appointees going in with a Clinton appointee to unanimously conclude that the maps needed to be redrawn. It's a bit surprising that we didn't have more than 5 justices and it was tethering on the line. That's something that's a little surprising. But to see Justices Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts join in with 3 liberal justices, and for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to actually rule on the case himself, I think that's a pretty big deal. That part of it is. I wish that more justices would have gone along with them, especially given how this came up from the Circuit Court of Appeal and the fact that you could look at this and you could see your Circuit Court of Appeals. You look at this case and you look at the fact that 26% of Alabama is actually Black. What would make you think that you should only have voters in a position to have one of their 7 members of Congress elected that would reflect the makeup of the demographic? That's pretty difficult.
Now, Alabama has 7 congressional districts. From what we understand, this entire map is going to have to be withdrawn. Am I correct? Or redrawn,
correct,
I
yes.
should say. So the map will have to be redrawn.
The map will have to be redrawn, yes. And it has to be redrawn in such a way that voters are in a position to elect a member of their choice. So the whole issue of packing voters, minority voters in one district when you could have folks interspersed in a different way so that they're able to truly elect someone in a representative democracy of their choice is a pretty big deal.
Now, what is the timeline for Alabama lawmakers? I assume they have to go back into session and redraw these congressional maps. Do they have a certain time frame that they have to have this completed by?
I'm not sure what that time frame is exactly, but the answer is yes. And I can tell you that it is anticipated that these maps will need to be redrawn, or they're required to have them redrawn and considered in time for them to take effect before the next election cycle in 2024. So this will influence what takes place in the presidential election year and in that cycle for new members of Congress to be seated. So about 24 in time for the primary and then for the general election. Yes, sir, it should be done by the middle of next year for sure.
Now,
They can't drag their feet on this.
Okay. Alabama, Georgia, and other states who have had a history of drawing gerrymandered, perhaps racially gerrymandered congressional districts and other districts have been, until over the past few years, under a federal mandate that has now since been removed, that was part of the Voting Rights Act. Can you kind of
Yes.
explain that a little further?
With pleasure. So, part of the reason that there was a surprise with what's going on right now, part of the reason for the surprise is the fact that in 2013, a case came down, Shelby County versus Holder, and it was actually from the state of Alabama. And I'm a former federal judicial law clerk in the U.S. District Court Middle District of Alabama. It chiseled away at Section 2, which has this requirement that before you change maps or do certain things that could affect voting and voting rights, you have to get federal approval to do that through the Department of Justice. That was obliterated in 2013. As a result of that and that impact on Section 2, you found across the country that more conservative state legislators were actual legislatures were actually coming up with new maps and with new rules around voting rights because they didn't have to go through this pre-clearance requirement. And then in 2018, a case emanating from um, Arizona, Shelby County, not Shelby County, but Brnovich versus DNC, it further eroded these rights and came up with some Alito factors for what can and should be considered. And it made it near impossible to mount a challenge against Section 2 of the voting, under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So because those two things had happened, and the court has since grown more conservative, it was believed that it very well could have been that Section 2 would have been essentially declared unconstitutional, and based on the dissent from Justice Thomas, we would see that there is a consideration. But when you look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965 comprehensively, and what it was designed to actually do, it was to protect against racial discrimination in voting. That was the objective of it in 1965 when it passed as a result, in great part, of the attempted march that took 3 attempts, with folks moving from Selma to Montgomery. So I find it ironic that 58 years later, we're still looking at cases from Alabama. So I see this as a justice. It has not been completely obliterated. It sends the message, clear message, I believe, to states. This is what makes it so important that Justice Roberts penned this decision. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 does still exist. Section 2 still does exist. And if you do things that are extreme, that are a clear and flagrant violation of this Voting Rights Act, because of the reason that it existed to begin with, we will slap this down and send it back to you and say, go back to the thinking corner and get this right, because people deserve and have the right to elect officials that are of their choice.
We are talking with Alicia Hughes live from our Midtown studios. She is the interim director of the Center for Civil Rights and Social Justice at Emory Law School, talking about yesterday's Supreme Court decision that struck down a map in Alabama, a congressional map, as unconstitutional. What are the possible impacts here in Georgia?
The impacts are extraordinary, and right now we have a case that's working its way through the system that has been put on pause at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, looking at the Georgia Utilities Commission, for example, and we are electing commissioners to the Georgia Utilities. You know, that commission, they're elected statewide, and there's been a amount from the voters saying that that's a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So it very well could be now, as a result of this decision coming down, and this is legal precedent now from the United States Supreme Court, if it is found, it very well could be that the way that those commissioners are elected will no longer be at large. Just as one example, may no longer be at large, but they may have to be according to, or in a way that is consistent with how we're electing members of Congress now. That could change the makeup or composition of a utilities commission here, public commission, right here in Georgia. So I think that when you look around the country, there's a case coming down in South Carolina that will also be decided in this Supreme Court term. So it should come out before the middle of July. based on Section 2 Voting Rights Act violation being alleged here also. So I see this having wide-ranging effects across the country. So it should show a little bit with legislators and state lawmakers doing things that would clearly be a violation of the rights of their states, especially when you're looking at the population and the number of folks from other minority, groups across their state populations too. So I think that there are wide-ranging effects to give you the answer.
We're wrapping up our live conversation here on the Atlanta News First digital streaming desk with Alicia Hughes, Interim Director of the Center for Civil Rights and Social Justice at Emory Law School. Final question, is there a chance that Georgia's congressional districts will be redrawn as a result of this decision?
It is possible. If there is a challenge mounted and it is found that the way that this is drawn would stop or have a substantial impact on minority voters being able to elect their candidates of choice, that is something that is very possible. But when you look at the way that the map is drawn right now and the fact that we've got Lucy McBath with the district that she has, look at the fact that there is Black Republican member of Congress right now, when you look at the composition, I think that there's a less of a likelihood that we'd have to redraw our maps, but it remains to be seen. It would take a challenge to the map's composition currently being challenged by voters for us to have an analysis of that done. But right now, I think that we're okay, but there is a possibility if it is found that this is not truly representative government where every voter has the right to vote for someone and get someone elected that would be of their choice. That very well could be something that would happen right here in Georgia, yes.
Well, this is an issue we'll continue to follow as Georgia continues to truly be the center of the nation's political attention. Thanks to Alicia Hughes, the Interim
My
Director
pleasure.
of the Center for Civil Rights and Social Justice. And Emory, thanks to all of you for watching us live here on Atlanta News First.